Sarah Pila is here with what we need to know and how it affects us here in California.
Sure, because even though it's far away from California and Dubai, what happens there or what doesn't happen there does have big impacts here at home. And so for those that aren't familiar, this annual meeting is the 28th anniversary of the Conference of Parties, hence the term COP28. So world leaders, scientists, and various organizations will attend the two-week summit and assess whether the world is on track with its climate goals. But according to the UN emissions report that was released earlier this month, the world is not on track to limiting warming from surpassing the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. Now, that's the threshold that countries agreed upon back in Paris in 2015. Now, while we often hear about cutting our carbon dioxide emissions, which is, of course, important, one area of focus at COP will be on methane emissions, which is a super potent, invisible, odorless greenhouse gas. Now, in the short term, methane is over 80 times more powerful than carbon dioxide and is responsible for anywhere from a quarter to a third of today's warming. During the conference, the U.S. is expected to release new groundbreaking requirements for the oil and gas industry to curb methane emissions for both new and existing wells. The environmental advocacy group, the Environmental Defense Fund's John Goldstein, says this is a huge deal for reducing emissions.
This will mark the biggest final effort that the Biden administration will have finalized in the climate space to date. And I think it shows just what a big deal methane has become in the climate conversation, not just here in the US, but globally. And I think we're going to be hearing a lot about methane in the next, week plus coming out of Dubai, with these final EPA rules and then the broader global announcements and news that I'm sure will be coming as well.
Now, the proposed rules by the EPA would update reporting requirements and accuracy for methane emissions, which is one of the main drivers of climate change. And this includes regulations for energy production, infrastructure, and leaky pipelines, which is one of the highest sources of methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. Now, while the Paris Agreement calls for the world to reach net zero emissions by 2050, John says countries must also focus on reducing emissions in the short term while working on their overall large goal of transitioning to cleaner energy.
The International Energy Agency put out a report a few weeks ago that looked globally at methane emissions. And if you read the report, as one of the key points there is essentially that yes, we need to transition as fast as possible. And if we want to stay on a path towards 1.5 degrees of warming and limit it to that, we need methane standards on oil and gas in place as well. We can't do one or the other. We really have to do both.
Now, one thing to note about methane, while it is more potent than carbon dioxide, it lives in our atmosphere a much shorter amount of time. So once it's released, methane lasts about a decade or so, whereas carbon dioxide lives for a century or even more. So if we can limit methane emissions, that has a much shorter lifespan that will really help with contributing to the planet's warming. And now this methane summit is supposed to happen on December 2nd, and that is when the Environmental Defense Fund is expecting the U.S. to formally announce the new standards, and hopefully other countries can follow suit. The EU and China have also made announcements in the last few weeks, so we know that methane is one of those hot topics going into Dubai.
Right, but the backdrop is that all this started with controversy, right? With reports, leaked reports that Sultan Al Jaber was planning to actually make oil deals amidst the conference.
Yeah, there's definitely been a lot of controversy. First of all, I think a lot of folks were nervous that this is happening in an oil-rich country like the United Arab Emirates, even though, COP moves around to different regions. But these leaked documents that we learned about days before COP are troubling, and Al Jaber has denied the claims that that the UAE was going to try to make side deals for the oil and gas industry. So obviously lots of skepticism there. But I will say that the pressure is on, and especially on the UAE, and they will try to distance themselves from any influence of the fossil fuel industry that may be, still on people's minds, obviously, because this just happened.
And perhaps they're feeling that pressure because they're showing accomplishments already on day one?
Yes, so there is a major accomplishment, and it is a historic loss and damage fund that has been approved for nations most impacted by climate change. It is a significant achievement. It was been talked about last year in Egypt at COP27. This would deliver money to vulnerable countries that are facing climate emergencies. These are poorer countries that obviously have more inequities when it comes to climate impacts. They are the lowest emitters of fossil fuels, yet they are the ones hardest hit. And I will say, when we think about pressure on the UAE and maybe trying to take some of that off of them, they have decided that they will contribute $100 million to that fund. Germany will as well. The U.S. did also put in about 15 million or so. So, trying to take that pressure off, hopefully, by putting that 100 million as a pledge, maybe they're hoping that'll take some of the heat off of what they've been dealing with those side deals coming out of those reports.
All right, Sarah, thank you so much for tracking it for us this morning.